Good afternoon and welcome back to Dr. Logic Awkwardly Does Logic. In this video, we're going to do something a little bit different from anything that we've done before, in part because this is the first time that we have the opportunity to do it. Now, it has to do with the different axiomatizations of S5 that I've given you, and I've already said that, the way that you prove that these generate the same logical system is you show that you can derive one set of axioms from the other and vice versa. But I'm going to give you another argument, or at least a sketch of an argument. I will leave the details for you to fill in and tell me if you've gotten them right or not. Anyway, the idea is we want to give an alternative characterization of these systems through the frames and the frame properties that characterize them. Because you can think of a logic not as just a set of axioms and the theorems it generates, but if you've got well-behaved semantics, as all of the things that are valid in a particular well-behaved, nice class of frames. If you think about the logical systems in this way, then what we can do to show that our two axiomatizations of S5 are equivalent systems is to show that they generate the same class of frames. So that's what we're going to do. So let's get out the whiteboard because we need to do our recollections. We've got the one version of the axiomatization, which is k plus t plus e, and the other, which is k plus t plus b plus 4. So thinking in terms of frames and classes of frames, we can ignore k because k is just the collection of all frames. But let's look at the frame conditions for the other axioms. T, we've seen, corresponds to reflexivity. So in both cases, the frames for the logics characterized by these class of axioms are going to be reflexive. But then all of our other axioms are different. This, you'll recall, was the Euclidean property, which says if you've got something that looks like this, where one world can see two worlds and one of those two worlds can see one, then you can draw the line back the other way. Here, we've got much simpler notions of symmetry and transitivity. So let's concentrate on this collection of frame properties first. So they are reflexive, transitive, and symmetric. If you've ever come across these collection of properties of a binary relation before, you'll know that what this gives us is an equivalence class. The idea is that once we start relating worlds, they all end up getting related to each other, so they can all see each other. There isn't essentially any way of distinguishing them in terms of what they can see. So let's just draw a whole bunch of worlds. There we go. And now what would we need to do to turn this into an S5 class of frames that satisfies reflexivity, symmetry, and transitivity? So every world would have to be able to see itself, otherwise it's not reflexive. So that would be the same as if we had the same set of worlds. Now what I'm going to do here, I'm going to draw the same, use the same set of worlds, but kind of track both of these at the same time. So if I wanted to also turn this set of worlds into a frame for this logic, well, we would also have to have that they're all reflexive. So this is all the same. There we go. Lovely. Both of these now are frames for these logics. Every world can see itself and nothing else. This means that they are all reflexive, they are degenerately symmetric, transitive, and Euclidean. But let's make this a little bit more interesting. Suppose that this world can, in fact, see this world. Well, because, again, we're looking at the red relation here, because this relation is symmetric, we also know that this world has to see this one. So again, all of a sudden we've got two worlds. They can see all exactly the same things. Same if I did a line between these two. But now let's make it a bit more complicated. Instead of having singletons and then pairs of things, well, what happens if, say, this world could see this one? Well, by symmetry, we know that this one can go back and see this one, but now we've got a chain of 3 worlds that are connected to each other. Transitivity says, well, if this one can see this one and this one can see this one, then the first one can see the third one. But symmetry tells us you can go back the other way. So this gives you a picture of how the equivalence class notion of the frame condition sort of partitions your set of worlds into worlds that can see everything in this group and nothing outside of its group. So like these two can see each other and themselves, and these 3 can all see each other and themselves, but they can't kind of get out of this. I will say something more about that, but probably at the end of this video. But now let's look at this blue relation. Let's say that we've got something that, we don't want to have just degenerate Euclideanness, but something more robust. So this world is the sort of thing where from here to here you can see this, and this one can also see this. Well, the Euclidean property says that either this one has to be able to see this one or the other way around. So let's say this, but then because of it's all universally quantified, we end up with our little triangle. But now turn around and think in terms of how, so this world can see itself and it can see this, which means that there has to be an arrow between both of them. So we can go back this other direction. This world again sees itself and sees this other world. By the Euclidean property, there has to be an arrow going both direction. And what do we have here? We have another reflexive, transitive, and symmetric equivalence class. Okay, this frame turned out messier than I thought that it would, but hopefully this gives you a bit of an insight as to why these characterize the same logics. It's because they characterize exactly the same class of frames. Anytime that you have reflexivity plus Euclideanness, you are going to get reflexivity, symmetry, and transitivity, and the other way around. So if you would like to prove somewhat more in detail than I've done that this is the case, here's what you need to do. Assume that you have a frame that is reflexive, symmetric, and transitive, but that it has three worlds that fail to be Euclidean. You'll be able to get a contradiction from this. Similarly, assume that you have a frame that is reflexive and Euclidean, but that it either fails transitivity or symmetry. And from these assumptions, you will be able to derive a contradiction. And this is how you can show that these characterize the same class of frames. So the last thing that I want to say about this, I'll try to draw you a slightly nicer frame. I'm not going to draw any of the arrows because that's part of what made things messy. But you can think of S5 frames as essentially taking a bunch of worlds and grouping them together. So like these are in an equivalence class and these are in an equivalence class, and that one's on its own. Maybe this one is connected with all of these. So within each of these pink shapes, you can just assume that every world can see every other world. This is almost the same, but not quite the same as the relation being universal. So a universal relation just says everything can see everything else. Within each one of these equivalence classes, within one of these clusters, what we have is a universal relation. But what we don't have is universality across the entire set of worlds, because what's in here can't see what's in here. So this is an important thing to remember, because often when we are building S5 frames, they are going to have universal relations because we don't care about the arbitrary kind of detached parts. The bits outside of the bit we're working in, we will never be able to see, we will never be able to access, so who really cares about them? We care about them from the technical point of view of what our definitions say. So it's important to remember that essentially, while most of the S5 frames that we actually will be looking at will be ones that are essentially, say, just a cluster like this and everything in it, we can't forget that S5 frames, which are essentially various ones of these little clusters all written down next to each other, still count as S5 frames. So there's a kind of frame-based semantic sort of approach, as I said, somewhat different from some of the arguments that we've been given. Go ahead and see if you can fill in some of the details. I'm happy to check your work if you put it in the comments. And now we're really getting a sense of how S5 works. What are its structures, its axioms, the frames that it's in. We're going to look at what its equivalents, what its modal equivalences are. What kind of reduction principles does it have? Because this will allow us to show something really, really cool about S5. So join me next time. Until then, take care. Cheers.